This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Hello, everybody. We're so glad to see you here today. And we hope you've had a good morning. I know you've been busy since 8 o'clock. That's very early to start your retreats. I'm Susan Ashmore. I'm an associate professor of history at Oxford College, and I serve as a faculty counselor to the audit committee for the Board of Trustees. And I teach modern American history, and my scholarship focuses on the 20th century South. So I wanted to ask you to please put your cell phones on silent if you haven't done that already. That'll be make our time together really great. So we have two of Emory's best historians with us to discuss why history matters. And there are full biographies, I think, in your little booklet. So I will only make the briefest of introductions in order to use our time wisely. Dr. Patrick Allitt will speak first, and he is the Cahoon Family Professor of American History. He grew up in England and has been teaching American history at Emory since 1988. In 2009, Yale University Press published his most recent book, The Conservatives: Ideas and Personalities Throughout American History. In a June interview about his new book, he said, "I argue that conservatism is contextual and reactive. Conservatives believe that civilization is complex, precious, and delicate, always vulnerable to threats from external enemies and from impetuous reformers within. As the threats have changed over the decades, so has the nature of conservatism." Dr. Deborah Lipstadt is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies. In 1998, she created the Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory and directed this institute until 2008. Her new book, The Eichmann Trial, she brought a copy today so we can see that at the end, was published this year in the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Eichmann Trial. You may have seen Franklin Foer's review in the April 10th New York Times Book Review. It was an amazing review. He said, "Lipstadt has done a great service by untethering the trial from Hannah Arendt's polarizing presence, recovering the event as a gripping legal drama, as well as a hinge moment in Israel's history and in the world's delayed awakening to the magnitude of the Holocaust." So you can tell from the subjects of their most recent books that indeed history matters. First, we'll hear from Dr. Allitt, then Dr. Lipstadt, and then we will have some conversation.
Thanks very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you can tell from my voice, I'm English, and I teach American history to American kids here at Emory. So there's always a strange moment at the beginning of every semester when the students listen to me for a minute or two and they say, "You're the US history teacher?" But they're so charming and so gracious that after the first few days, I think the strangeness and novelty wears off, and we get right down to business. Now, have you noticed that most people get more interested in history as they get older? To kids, to most children, history is a bit of an ordeal, it's a bit of a trial, partly because the textbooks are so heavy and dull and lifeless. And of course, if the history teacher is bad, learning history is just as appalling as, I don't know, eating cold Brussels sprouts. You know, it could hardly have less engagement with their own lives. But then, isn't it true that as you get older, especially once you pass your 50th birthday, you start realizing that you're actually part of history. History isn't something that just happened once and for all and then finished. It's actually going on now, and that you've been a participant in it, and that what your kids read about as the Carter administration. No, you say, "Oh, I remember this. In fact, I knew President Carter." You can talk to them and say, "No, it's a real person facing real issues and problems." And then, of course, when you talk to your kids or grandchildren, they're fascinated, or they can be fascinated, to learn about the world in which you grew up, a world of incredible hardships, you know, without personal computers. A world of typewriters and fountain pens and record players and things like this. And the stuff, and you say, well, it was perfectly ordinary in our day. We didn't regard ourselves as living lives of horrifying privation. It was just what the world was like. And the kids go, "Oh, incredible." You know, and I always think, I remember this, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley back in the early 80s, I had a girlfriend who was, she was working as a temp at a law firm. And she came home one day and she said, "They've got this incredible thing at work. It's like a typewriter attached to a TV. And when you put in the words, they come up on the TV. And if you miss a word, you can put it in anywhere, and the other words all move aside. And we all think, wow, what a great thing." And obviously by now, you know, within a few years, we'd all got one, hadn't we? So, one of the uses of history is just simply to kind of think about your own life and the way in which the context, the setting of your own life has been changing. But obviously there's a lot more to it than that. History is really the only thing we've got to understand the world that we've come from and to think about the kind of world that we might be moving into. Inevitably, we're interested in trying to think about the future, and history gives us a fund of lessons to apply in thinking about what's going to happen next. But now, there are temptations with history, and I think there are particular temptations with American history. If you're American, you're a citizen of a country that's been very lucky. It's actually possible to think of American history as a series of moral jumps. And in fact, this is a way in which it often tends to get taught this way in grade school and sometimes even in high school. This idea that back in the 18th century, America had a terrible problem, and the problem was the British. But then luckily they overcame it in the Revolution and sort of moved up onto a higher plane. And then in the early 19th century, they had a terrible problem, which was the problem of slavery. But then they overcame it in the Civil War and moved up to another level. Yeah? Do you remember learning it like this? That somehow, I mean, it's easy to get into the frame of mind of thinking that the history is the struggle of right against wrong, in which right wins. Now, America is one of the very, very few places you can actually study history that way. You certainly couldn't do that if you lived in Poland or Ireland. You think about Polish history, it's all tragedy. Yeah? You can't possibly make the claim that each stage of Polish history is somehow higher and better than the others. And as soon as you realise that, it gets you thinking, so perhaps history isn't really the struggle of right against wrong, in which right comes out ahead. It might not really be like that. Now, one thing I'm constantly saying to students here at Emory is this. History is not the struggle of right against wrong, it's the struggle of right against right. They don't like that because it takes away this very, very emotionally gratifying feeling. I mean, do you ever have this experience? You watch a movie and at the end you feel, oh yes, you know, this enormous cathartic sense of rightness and happiness and contentment. Yeah? When you hear a historical lesson which gives you that feeling, it's almost certainly bad history. Yeah? History's not really like that. History's much, much more complicated. It won't give you gratifying little lessons, or at least it will only do so if you cut it up in very, very particular ways and leave out all sorts of difficult and awkward information. So when I'm teaching history, I say to students, look, it's the conflict of right against right. I mean, for example, I sometimes say to students, I say to a student, when was the last time in which the Confederacy could realistically expect to win the Civil War? And sometimes the students say, oh, but they were the losers. Almost as though they'd marched into battle thinking, we're the losers. You know, it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to get back into the frame of mind of people who didn't know they were the losers. Of course, the better students very quickly understand the point, start thinking, oh yeah, when was it? Was it just before Pickett's charge at Gettysburg? They speculate like that. And then I say, now what were the arguments the Confederates used to convince themselves that they were right? You know, what about the defenders of slavery? Did the defenders of slavery say, we're wrong and we know it? No, assuredly they didn't say that. They said, we're right, and here's why we're right. They had arguments to make. And to understand the history of slavery, or the history of anything, you've got to get the students to think like the slave owners. You've got to get them, at least provisionally, into the mind of the person who's doing something which they assuredly now disapprove of. I mean, in other words, you've got to be very quick on your feet to be a good historian. First, you've got to see the world as the slave owner saw it. Then you've got to see the world as the slave saw it. Then you've got to see the world as the abolitionist saw it. And then you've got to see the world as the northern anti-abolitionists saw it. To understand all these different groups who were all in conflict with each other, all thinking that they were right. Because, of course, people come into conflict because they think they're right, and sometimes because they're even willing to die for their belief in their rightness. Yeah? That's why it's so difficult and why it's so complicated. And of course, it's a great discipline. And I sometimes say this to students as well. It's a discipline being a student. You've got to have the discipline to sit still and listen. And you've also got to have the discipline to think uncomfortable thoughts. If you only think comfortable thoughts, you're never really going to understand history at all. It's much more difficult than that. Now, the next thing is this question about the lessons of history. And politicians love talking about the lessons of history. But let me counsel you, we've got another presidential season coming up. As soon as a politician from either party says, here's the lesson of history, what will happen next is that you won't be told the truth. Or at least, you won't be told... And similarly, when a politician says, the American people, instantly, that's a moment to turn off, isn't it? Because the American people don't want anything. The American people doesn't really exist. There's all sorts of groups of people who want different things. Where was I? Oh, right, lessons of history. It is true that we can derive lessons from history, but it's hardly ever the case that you can look at a historical incident and say, here's what happened, and therefore here's the lesson. Hardly ever. I'll give you an example. After the terrible tragedy of the First World War, when people look back at what had happened in 1914 to start the fighting, what they said was, we were too quick to jump into conflict. And the reason we were so quick was because we believed that now that warfare was so mechanized, now that there were railroads and machine-operated weapons, anyone who didn't mobilize quickly was going to be at a terrible disadvantage. Yeah? We were all on a hair-trigger alert from fear that if we didn't mobilize quickly, we'd lose almost straight away. And that's why, of course, in the 1930s, as the possibility of a new war began to approach, the responsible politicians in Europe said, let's not make that mistake again. Let's be careful. Let's appease Hitler. Appeasement was the adult, the grown-up, the sensible thing to do, which applied the lessons of the First World War. But of course it went tragically wrong, didn't it? Because it isn't as though Hitler was appeased. On the contrary, he interpreted it as a sign of weakness, which he was able to exploit. So then after the Second World War, the lesson of the Second World War was, fight the enemy early when he's far away and weak, because if you don't, you're going to have to fight him later when he's stronger and closer. That's why the Americans went to war in Vietnam. Vietnam posed no kind of problem to America directly in the mid-1960s, but the lesson of what had happened in the late 30s was the lesson being applied. So there you see two lessons. One is go to war quickly, and the other one is don't. And of course, because history never really repeats itself, anyone who's choosing one lesson knows that they're going to choose a lesson which might prove to be completely wrong, and that conditions have changed anyway. Yeah? Very, very difficult indeed. And of course, people with the very best motives and intentions can make the wrong decision, and they do so constantly. We can all think of examples of that. And let me give you one more example, which is actually a little segue into Dr. Lipstadt's talk. During the First World War, especially after 1917, when the Americans went into the war directly themselves, there were lots of stories circulating in America about the terrible atrocities that the Germans had done. There was a great burst of anti-German fever in America, that they'd raped the nuns in Belgium and that they'd crucified prisoners of war and that they'd committed horrible acts of atrocity. Now, and this wasn't only in the papers, it was preached by ministers, saying Jesus may have preached peace in his own time, but that's only because he didn't face anyone as horrible as the Germans are now. After the war, these stories almost all proved to be untrue. And a lot of Americans who'd used these stories felt deeply ashamed of having believed them and of having spread them around, and said to themselves, conscientiously, we're not going to believe stories like that again. Now, the result is that in the 1930s, when they started hearing about Hitler's persecution of the Jews, they said, oh, we've heard stories like that before. We got taken in by these crazy atrocity stories. We're not going to do that again. And so they were skeptical. I mean, one of the terrible, terrible difficulties for Jewish organizations in America was to get people to believe it was really happening. So again, you see, the Americans were wrong twice. They were wrong the first time for being too credulous, and they were wrong the second time for being too skeptical. It's very, very difficult indeed to know what the lessons of history are. And finally, it's very difficult to know about the future. Have you ever had this experience? You think, I'm finally going to clear out the basement. I've put it off for years, now I'm going to clean out the basement. Have you done that? And you go down there, and you find, one of the things you find is a pile of old Life magazines from 1950. Yeah? And so rather than actually clean out the basement, you start looking at these fascinating old magazines, and they're all, they smell a bit odd. And you come to one from 1951, and it says, the world in the year 2000, what it's going to be like. And it's hilariously funny, isn't it? Because it's so wrong. In other words, the 1950 idea of what the year 2000 was going to be like it tells you a lot about the year that the predictions were made, but nothing at all about the year which was being predicted. So, we're all going to have our own personal nuclear-powered hovercraft. You look around and think, hey, where's mine? Yeah, but it doesn't say anything at all about computers or bottled water or all the things that we actually lived with in 2000. So predictions of the future are usually hopeless. Occasionally somebody stumbles upon something which does turn out to be prophetic, but it's very, very hard indeed to say which of the thousands of predictions that are always being made is going to turn out to be a reasonable one. Let me leave it at that and turn over to Deborah.
I laughed at Dr. Allitt, Patrick's. He's British, so he calls me Dr. Lipstadt. I'm American, I call him Patrick. I laughed at his final comment about knowing the future. Just before I came here, I received an email I had received an email previously from a teacher in Australia who asked if one of her seniors, one of her top form students, could write me with some questions. So she had questions about my teaching, about the Holocaust, other things. And then she said, so what does your knowledge of the Holocaust tell you about the future? And I wrote back, I said, I'm just figuring out the past. I can't even handle figuring out the future. And I think that's entirely true, that it's, when anybody uses, I wouldn't say that we want to take history and say you can't learn anything about the future. But when anybody takes history and says, this teaches us A, B, C, and D exactly, run for the exits. If you glean from things and then you put it together and try to discern what it might teach you, then I think you're in good shape. A couple of points about, first about my teaching, and then to react to some of the points that Patrick made. In my class, especially I'm going to use as an example, well, in all my classes, because they're all virtually about the Holocaust. This past semester, I had the wonderful experience of co-teaching a class at the law school on, as a result of my work on the Eichmann Trial, on the impact of post-war, post-World War II war crimes trials, Nuremberg, Eichmann, and Auschwitz-Frankfurt trials in Germany in '63, on current genocide law. And we had graduate students and law students in it. And it was terribly exciting, and yet we once again figured out that you can't use the past as a simple template for the future. But in all my classes, including certainly that class, but even in my undergraduate classes, my freshman seminar, I'll teach a freshman seminar in the fall on films of the Holocaust. We use various propaganda films, compare feature films from the 60s to feature films from the year 2000, et cetera, look at propaganda, Nazi propaganda films, American propaganda films. Many of the students come in expecting me to emote. That this is, you know, they're studying about something that they know is horrible, and that's going to be, I'm going to tell them that it's horrible, and I don't do that. I don't do that because they need to be told that what they're studying is horrible. They shouldn't be in the class. I mean, it should be obvious. And my job is to, unpack the facts, to unpack what happened and try to figure out how it happened. And what we're studying there is a moment when the world we came from, the world we inhabit, went terribly wrong. And what I'm trying to unpack is how did it go terribly wrong? Hitler didn't come into power on January 30th, 1933 and announce, I plan to murder 6 million Jews, I plan to kill lots of German handicapped people, I plan to persecute German gays, I plan to kill lots of my military opponents and civilian opponents. He didn't make these announcements. It unfolded. It happened. So what I'm trying to do with my students is study that unfolding, study that piece by piece. How does it happen? What sort of systems break down? When is it possible still for people to protest? When is it impossible for people to protest? What's the reaction of the person in the street? How do they acquiesce? Is the German, not every German, you look at Leni Riefenstahl's famous documentary, Triumph of the Will, and you see these German faces full of adulation for the Fuhrer, for Hitler. But not everyone was like that, but there were enough people like that, together with people who are willing to say, well, I don't like all this anti-Semitism talk, I don't like this terrible expansionist talk, but I've got a good job. I don't like, you know, maybe what we've done in Poland, but I've got more food than anybody else in all of Europe. So you made accommodations. Now, I don't have to stand there and say, that's a bad thing to do. That's for them to figure out, and that's for them to figure out what they might do in that place. But at the same time, I try to be very careful. You know, students are self-assured. As we get older, we think history matters. Also, as we get older, we realize we don't know everything. But my students, I think, come into the class sure that they know a whole lot more than I hope they think that they think they'll know in 20 years. But they are convinced that they would have done the right thing. They are convinced that they would have reacted in a certain way. And I want to complicate it for them. And with that, I deal less with the perpetrators, but more with the victims. Susan, you give me a copy of the book. more with the victims. For instance, I have Jewish students, non-Jewish students. I have students of run the gamut in the classroom. I used to be able to tell by the names, but now you can't tell by the name. O'Connor could be an Orthodox Jew, and Rosenblatt could be Episcopalian. But students self-identify. They mention, they come and they say, I've studied this before. I've never studied this. They used to come when I first started teaching and say, my mother is a survivor, my father's a survivor. Now they say my grandparents are survivors. Last year, in fact, in my freshman seminar, we were studying about the Kindertransport, the children taken out of Germany and brought to England, and one of the students' grandfather had been on the Kindertransport. So we went over to ESIT in the library, and we Skyped the grandfather. I mean, of course, he knew. We didn't just, say, hello, we're here. But his daughter went, the student's mother was there to help, and they brought along an 11-year-old to make sure they could get the Skype working well. And the students, he could see us, and we could see him, and they had this wonderful conversation about being on the Kindertransport. But the students are convinced. They're convinced particularly when it comes to the victims and to fighting back. I would have fought back. I would never. And they're smart enough not to speak contemptuously of the victims, but there's this sense of, I wouldn't have let this happen to me. I would have somehow escaped. I wouldn't be surprised if you get similar things when you study about slavery. I would have escaped. I would have gone, found the Underground Railroad. I would have gotten out of there. I'm sure both of you would counter that. So I say to them, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to set up a scenario and end with a question. I don't want you to tell me the answer, and in truth, you shouldn't even answer it for yourself because you really can't figure it out. I said, imagine that you were in a ghetto with your family, exactly the age you are now. Parents in their 40s, which to them, of course, is ancient, for those days, and younger sister and brother. And you have a chance to try to escape. But you know that if you escape, your family is going to be immediately deported. And you know what deportation means. You know that. What do? Don't answer. In other words, I want to complicate it for them. And the reason I asked Susan to pass me over the book is that when I was writing my book about the Eichmann Trial, of course, reading the transcripts of the trial over and over again, I came across a very powerful moment in the trial. And I want to read you the section that's the half page from it about that. But to set it up, the witness was a magistrate from Tel Aviv, a man named Moshe Baisky, who was a survivor, a Polish survivor, who goes on to occupy play a very respected role on the High Court, the Israeli High Court, the equivalent of our Supreme Court. And he comes to the trial to testify about his experience in Poland. And when he comes in, the judge is Judge Landau, who just died at age 99. The presiding judge says to him, you're welcome to sit. And he says, no, I prefer to stand. He's a man of the court. He feels the court deserves a certain dignity. And when you give testimony, you stand. So for the first, I would say, half hour, 40 minutes, he doesn't speak in complete sentences. He speaks in complete paragraphs. I read the English translation. I read the original Hebrew. I listened to the transcript. This guy knows exactly what he wants to say and how he wants to make his point. And then he begins to describe a moment when he's in one of the camps when 15,000 people, 15,000 prisoners were ordered by SS men armed with machine guns and bayonets to watch as a young boy was brought to be hanged. The child was lifted up to the gallows, but the rope broke. Baisky recalled. He was again lifted up on a high chair which was placed under the rope. The child then began to beg for mercy. An order was given to hang him a second time. Baisky had just barely begun to describe this harrowing scene when Prosecutor Hausner pounced. 15,000 people stood there, and opposite them just a couple of hundred guards. Why didn't you attack? Why didn't you revolt? Baisky struggled to respond. The articulate witness was replaced by a man who floundered, groped for words, and left sentences unfinished. And in fact, in the transcript, the transcriber puts in ellipses, to show that she isn't losing words, but these weren't complete sentences. This was already in the third year of the war. Nonetheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. Maybe they needed our labor. Maybe, possibly. Then mid-sentence, he stops, and he turns to the judge, and he asks permission to sit. So you can see this man is a rebroken man. And then he goes on to say, I cannot describe this terror-inspiring fear. Nearby us, there was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles. 100 meters beyond the camp, they had a place to go to, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles. But where could any of the Jews go? We were wearing clothes, which were dyed yellow with stripes. In the center of our head, they made a kind of swath in a stripe 4 centimeters wide. And at the moment, let us suppose that the 15,000 people within the camp even succeeded without armed strength to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. Where could they go? What could they do? You can see he's trying to portray this. So when I read, and he, by the way, afterwards, he confronts Hausner and says, why didn't you warn me you were going to ask that? Hausner said, because I wanted an answer, we might say, that came from the gut. I wanted an unrehearsed answer. But here's what I write in the book. After reading Beisky's unrehearsed answer, I photocopied it and slipped the page into the file folder I used for my weekly lectures at Emory in my Holocaust history course. Someday, probably long before this manuscript appears as a book, a student will ask, why didn't they fight back? And I will give the spontaneous testimony Gideon Hausner elicited from a very brave, but at that moment, rebroken man. What I want to do with this material, I want them to get to think about this moment. I want them to realize how it unfolded step by step by step. But I also want them to realize that the people to whom it happened and the people who did it were no different than they. One hopes basically there was a difference, but they weren't monsters. They weren't Martians who came down and somehow took over Germany and made this happen. But these were normal people who grew up in normal homes. They weren't all bullies, as one person has tried to argue that the Nazis were all bullied, the leading Nazis were all bullied, and that's too simplistic. I want to show them that history is complicated. I want to show them that it matters. I've been inundated with requests. Some of you may have seen it. I wrote about the Demjanjuk trial recently. Bin Laden, Mladic, Bin Laden. Think of the parallels between the Eichmann trial and Bin Laden. 2 countries with friendly relations with the second country, Israel with Argentina, America with Pakistan, go into that country unasked, unannounced, to grab someone whom they see, one as a genocidal killer of the past, another as they see as a killer of the present. In one case, he's brought to trial. The other case, he's killed on the spot. And this is not by any way to criticize the SEALs. This was part of armed conflict when they went for bin Laden. But my regret, but just to talk about the importance of trials. And this morning, the BBC talked about Mladic arriving in The Hague and said this may be, well, one of the most important post-war crimes trials. The thing that will distinguish that trial from Nuremberg and its results, and I don't have time really to talk about it, but maybe in the conversation, the lesson we learned from the Eichmann trial, the thing we see in the Eichmann trial, is that Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, brings close to 100 witnesses to tell their story in the first person singular. This is my story, this is what happened to me. Since the Eichmann trial, we've never had a war crimes trial without the voice of the victim. We didn't have it at Nuremberg, that was all documents. And that first person singular, that first person voice is so important. And that's another message I want to get across to the students. And having said that, just I'll close by reading to you the last paragraph of my book. A number of years ago, I was invited to a conference at Yad Vashem, the memorial in the Research and Memorial Museum in Jerusalem to the Holocaust. While there, I met a group of young Rwandans who had asked Yad Vashem to train them in how to conduct oral testimony with trauma victims. They wanted to ensure that the history of the genocide that had decimated their country and their families would be preserved. Yad Vashem, eager to make them feel comfortable, arranged for them to have dinner on their first night in Jerusalem with French-speaking Holocaust survivors. By the end of the dinner, the 2 groups of survivors had bonded so strongly that the elderly survivors took the young Rwandans under their wings, invited them to their home, introduced them to their families, and began to build personal relations, also wrecking the schedule of the conference, but that's for another time. One afternoon, I sat with some of the young Rwandans outside of Yad Vashem, overlooking the Judean hills. They told me of their experience during the genocide and their meeting with the Holocaust survivors. One young man whose entire family had been murdered said to me, quote, "I want to tell my story and help my fellow Rwandan survivors tell theirs, just like the Holocaust survivors. I want people to listen to me as they listen to them." Despite the inherent contradiction in his next statement, I understood what he meant and recognized the passion with which he said it. I had heard it many times from from Holocaust survivors. Future generations, those who were not there, must remember, and we who were there must tell them. This may be the most enduring legacy of what occurred in Jerusalem in 1961. The telling of history, the telling of history in the first person singular. We can't write history alone from the voice of the witness, but the voice of the survivor, the voice of the witness, has become an integral part of our writing of history. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to add just a little anecdote from my own experience, and then say something that then you all can then enter the conversation. I just got back from taking 9 students on a tour of we called it Civil Rights in the American South. And we started at Koinonia Farms, and we went to Montgomery, and then to Lowndes County and Selma, then Birmingham, then Jackson, the Delta, Oxford, Mississippi, and then we ended in Memphis. And after 10 days, flew back home, and we're exhausted. But one of the interesting things that ties in with both of your approaches is also how history is remembered. And there are monuments all over the place in the areas where we went, and it reminded us of the long legacy of the Civil War and how much that legacy of the Civil War, you begin to see this dual narrative between the ways the civil rights history is remembered and the way the Civil War is remembered. And so when we started in Andersonville, I wanted them to see Andersonville and to see what had happened, and then they kept asking, why are all these northern monuments here? We're in Andersonville, Georgia. And so we talked some about the aftermath of the war and who had the money to put monuments up and why would they put them here. And then we go into this little village of Andersonville, and there's the monument to the man who was the overseer of Andersonville. And there the town got to have its say and its monument. And then through the whole trip, we kept seeing these monuments and having these dual narratives. And when we got to Ole Miss, we saw the monument to the Confederate soldier that's right there in the grove, and it's this very, we saw those kind of monuments everywhere. And then just around the corner is the monument where James Meredith is honored for integrating the University of Mississippi. And they sat down and really had this long conversation with each other about what does it mean that this monument is here? What does this monument tell us? And one African-American student, she said, I just feel like this is about the university and not about what James Meredith had to go through and where is the struggle. And then we talked about how do you commemorate that? How do you make a monument to that? How do we deal with this in this way?
When you build the Holocaust Museum, very often you'll hear from survivors, don't start with January 30th, 1933, start with the world that was destroyed. Tell them that we were normal people, that we were regular people, we had a rich, variegated life. So it's the same thing that you're saying.
And so these students, when we got to the end, there were lots of things they learned from this trip, but one student said, I've been in your class, 2 classes with me, the New South and Civil Rights History, and she said, I never quite understood why you kept talking about monuments all the time. And now I can't avoid seeing them, and I really understand that. But that memory piece is another really important part of how we understand what happened. And it was interesting, they did not think the monument to the Confederacy cause at Ole Miss should be taken down. They wanted it to be contextualized. They wanted it to be explained. And I loved that because I felt like they got it. We don't need to remove, we need to explain. Yeah, so anyway. So one of the things I wanted to just throw out here is that both of your approaches to teaching history is such an invitation. You are inviting students to enter in and to see that it's not, oh, I just need to memorize these dates and memorize these people, and then that's all there is to it. And I think that invitation is so welcoming. And I just wonder, do you find that once they get over the initial sense, oh, I don't have to just memorize some dates and names that I'm really asking to enter this story, do they then come at you in a new way, or can you feel that change, or how do your students respond to these invitations?
Well, different students respond in different ways. Some of them are much more enthusiastic than others. But I do think that because there's such a lot of initial resistance to the study of history, one of the things we've got to do as history teachers is get over the initial sense of resistance, and particularly get back into the feeling of contingency. For me, this is the most important thing. Getting people to realize that just as we don't know what the events of the year 2015 were, so nobody in 1861 knew what the events of 1864 were. Once it has happened, and once it's been written down, once it's been sort of consolidated between the pages, it seems so inevitable. And getting rid of the feeling of inevitability is really the first step. So I would say that that sense of contingency is one thing. And the other is trying to get the students to realize that it's possible to be enthusiastic about it. I try, obviously, I put a lot of energy into it. And I sometimes say, which of you had this experience as kids? You liked history, but you didn't like the dates. Did anyone? Right. Now, see, I always say, I say, the dates are fantastic. The dates are almost the best of the lot. They're so beautiful, aren't they? I mean, think about a date like 1915. It's so compressed. There's such an enormous amount of information just in those 4 numbers. Look at this photograph. It's a photograph taken in 1915. Look at the 1915-ishness of it. You know, and you know, I bubble and infuse, and the kids going, whatever. But here's what happens. You see, it isn't as though they suddenly become enthusiastic about dates, but they do become, but they do remember, oh yeah, he was the guy who was enthusiastic about dates. It shows them that it's possible to become enthusiastic about all kinds of things. I mean, if I was teaching statistics, you know, I'd be doing the same thing about the difference between median and mean, probably. You know, show them you can care about this and you can enjoy it.
Just to go back to your comment, one of the things that I do that I find, well, one thing I won't be able to do much longer, but first something, I use memoirs in my class. Even though it's a history class, we read Primo Levi, we look at Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the comic book, which is fantastic, and got the Pulitzer Prize and really deserved it. And other, we don't do Knight or Anne Frank because I assume that they've read that. But we do memoirs, and I do a whole class on memoirs with Professor Balmer because I think that's such an important entry point. But I want to make another point that both of you sort of raised, and that is, you know, sort of students think they know what's coming. I'll give you, Ben Johnson and I had this conversation a long time ago when my book on my trial came out about the bombing of Dresden. I don't know if you remember. But people often say the bomb came at the end of the war. It was as if the Allies knew, oh, we only have 3 more months till the war. It's going to end the beginning of April in Berlin. You know, for the soldier on the ground, the bombing of Dresden was much closer to what than the end of the war? The Battle of the Bulge, which was barely an Allied victory. So complicate matters, and then you have this a number of 100,000 people killed when the city of Dresden itself says it was 19,000. Not that that's a small number, but it's a way of trying to paint an American atrocity when it's much more or an Allied atrocity when it's much more complicated. And so when this whenever people say things like the movie A Bridge Too Far, you know, that story of the end of the war, but you don't know we know it's the end of the war, but the people in the movie don't know it's the end of the war. And that's one of the things you want to sort of impress on students to have to separate themselves, you know, from what the South becomes to what it was then. I think both of those are very important.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.